So it says that acute emergencies threatening the world peace now exist in this period of conflict in Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America. To eradicate basically the source of conflict is to eradicate colonialism and all its manifestations, and to accept and practice a policy of peaceful coexistence in the world.
But it's so interesting that you're like really kind of highlighting this moment of peaceful coexistence, because I was reading the other day, finally, peaceful coexistence has been taken up by the BRICS as well, which I find extremely interesting in these times. And the relevance of non-alignment today is kind of evident in a way. I mean, you just read out this. But why is it so necessary, I wonder, like, and why is it not happening in a way? Because like, you know, we keep saying non-aligned movement and its legacy wherever it lies, and it definitely doesn't lie at one place, especially not like only Yugoslavia, even though former Yugoslavia somehow co-opted this topic for some reason.
But I'm just wondering if the cooptation is not also reflected in the larger cooptation of anti-colonial struggles, anti-imperial positions. That is something that you talked about at some moment too. There are anti-imperial positions that are co-opted in context of war, in context of violence, in context of, you know, in so many different violent contexts as well. So I see the non-aligned cooptation as part of a larger time of cooptation and emptified positions, emptified anti-colonial positions that are urgently needed but are now floating as decorations or as power improvements instead of tools to question power. So I think it's a very complicated time in which the system has learned how to swallow things, and
even by those ones who bear those legacies.
Yeah.
And like, especially sometimes, like, for example, the left is not that much like discussing the idea of non-alignment, but like the non-alignment is kind of present in the nationalist discourses. I find this very interesting, not wanting to kind of discuss this legacy in the context of which kind of power it holds today and what we could learn from it, so that like we could kind of really re-establish some discourses,
Right.
and then like this is somehow taken over by nationalists and like people who are interested in really co-opting those friendships, however they were constructed, on whichever base they were constructed, through all four false friendships, but like connections, let's call them connections,
Right.
into the discourse, which for example enables Tito's friendship or relation with non-alignment is being used today as a reason to invite delegations not to recognize independence of Kosovo. So it's like using the legacy of non-alignment for nationalist purposes. I really think that if we want to reuse or restage or like work with the legacy of non-alignment, it needs to be a multitude of legacies, first of all. And I think that some things need to be resolved first.
Right.
In the sense of, okay, who had this dominated or like hegemonic role within the movement as well. I think this is a crucial question that we need to resolve, so that the movement or the new non-aligned movement would become something which is truly against the power relations within the movement.
It's a reflection of our time, I feel also. Your question too, if I look at Austria, I feel, or the different localities of non-aligned, like the local histories of the non-aligned expressions of politics, they're very buried. They're very forgotten. They almost seem impossible. If we think of our political imaginaries, it's almost like we cannot imagine that this really is part of has been part of political struggles in Austria, in Germany, in different countries, like, you know, of course, ex-Yugoslavia, but also what are the local expressions? And I feel that to unearth these local pasts could also unsettle dominant perspectives of political struggles and movements. But the political subjects in those struggles were students, apprentices from the non-aligned countries which are not seen as political subjects here in this country, still not. So I feel there's still a lot for us to unearth without glorifying it, which is hard. Because I tend to glorify too, because there's a yearning to this, of this past, of those alliances.
But I somehow feel that all of these things are buried with this past of kind of neutrality. Somehow, like the talk about neutrality is something where this story ends. Because like people in Austria think that like neutrality is the same as non-alignment. And whenever you present kind of how about this, everyone is like, you mean neutrality? This is, this kind of moment of neutrality, which was in a way positive and anti-fascist statement, is also overshadowing the non-aligned struggles and non-aligned relations, right? So it's how national is the Austrian left.
Yeah, and also how, like, or if we start from another point, like Quinn Slobodian has this book called Foreign Fronts, where he proposes actually that the left, the German left, was radicalized by the non-aligned students who brought the urgencies of the struggles for decolonization into the center of a discourse that did not include that, by protesting, and I feel this is also reflected in Austria. There's this strong discourse. There was no colonialism. There were no post-colonial students and subjects here, and there's a erasure of that movement history as well. But I know this is a bit like comes maybe to glorification, but
what about the intercolonized ones? What about annexation
in addition,
of Bosnia and Herzegovina?
This is not discussed about. At least in some levels, there is some kind of discourse on that. But this idea that there were never struggles like of the global majority against colonialism on the streets of Austria, which is not the truth, or Germany as well. And in this case of the non-aligned movement, those issues are intertwined. We need to look at internal colonialism. We need to look at all the levels and manifestations of imperialism. And I know this might be glorifying, but I just printed, the Declaration of the Non-Aligned Countries in 1961, which was, they were formulated in Belgrade in 1961. And if you read excerpts, you could take those statements, and they're still urgent today. But they're not only urgent, but they're almost like a Geheimtipp today, So to eradicate the source of conflict is to eradicate colonialism. Is something that it's not something that is centered, in the peacemaking processes. This was on a state level, heads of state level. Those were not social movements meeting. This is really on a state level that recognized the centrality of the struggle against imperialism as basis for world peace.
Well, I think that states benefit from this colonialism, and they are deeply embedded in and related to, private companies that do run states. So, of course, the states don't stand for something like anti-colonial struggle because, it's not in their interest.
Right.
Or it's not in the interest of their, bosses,
right.
which are from the private sector. I mean, like, some of the struggles for liberation, I find some parallel, not complete one, but some potential of a parallel with the social movements today, for example, in Serbia, especially the anti-extraction movement.
Because those are the manifestations of present day neocolonialism.
Or maybe the life conditions are too precarious that you have to accept it even though you're not. I mean, we all accept it, right? So it's, I think that's the base things. How can you not accept something that you benefit from on your daily basis, you know? The moment that you get out of your bed, I mean, it's...
Yes, and at the same time, to quote again from the statement, war has never threatened, and I want to insert, humankind with graver consequences than today. You could take it one-on-one for today. At this time, there was a fear of nuclear war. And where are we today?
Same.
Where are we today? And I was just wondering with regards to neocolonialism, there's this quote by Kwame Nkrumah that I kind of moved into, where Kwame Nkrumah states that neocolonialism indices its victim with sweet music. That's like the packaging of neocolonialism. But if we think of present day's manifestations of neocolonialism, they more and more lose their package. If we look at the geopolitical changes that we are about to witness, starting from the States, like there's a different, it looks like there's a different form that is not a form that's indictment with sweet music, but it's actually war and threaten, like direct, the packaging.
Existential.
Yeah.
But when is it enough? I always ask myself, is our like level of tolerance of our, being in this world really too low these days? Or like, where is human dignity? I always ask myself. And how low can we go until we say, no, it's enough?
And there's a lot of enoughs as well. And those enoughs movements, be it in Istanbul, be it in Serbia, are also not featured as much as they should. Essential as they are also not featured as much and echoed, because every resistance also needs echoes.
Because they're selectively featured, and when you only feature one thing and not another, like also what we are doing today, what about the, protests in Congo? What about the protests that were happening here? I mean, I think that things have to be brought together.
But by saying it, we're weaving it together. And then, of course, if we mention all of it, we should also mention the war in Gaza. If we weave them all together, which is not done very often, we get a more complete picture. And I think this necessity of weaving it together is something that we need, and where we could learn from the non-aligned movement as well. And even our topic, Breathe Again, expresses the foundational importance of breathing and the impossibility of breathing in an imperialized world. But this is not so centrally rooted in the discourses. Like imperialism, you would think is something of the past.
But you know what I find extremely interesting about our topic? There is always like this geopolitical aspect, which somehow comes from our histories, right? And then there's Austria, right? So we're located here, and the way that this was bridged, I find fascinating, because we always talk on the level of, on the global level, right? But then we are here, and this has completely different implications. I mean, once you told me this story about when Nkrumah wanted to visit Austria, and like the requirements, maybe you can say something about it, because I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, so in this year, 1961, the year of the non-aligned movement meeting in Belgrade, Kwame Nkrumah actually visited Austria. And in preparation of his visit, his administration made the request to ask and inquire of a list of organizations in Austria that fight against colonialism and against racism. At that time, it was worded racial discrimination. And the question in itself was an intervention, was also an acknowledgement to present struggles in the 60s, in post-Nazistic Austria in the beginning of the 60s, that was busy portraying itself as victim of the Nazi regime. But I think those local levels are interesting. We are in Austria. There are many histories intersecting in this space. Like you said, this weaving together, it's not so much new things, it's just weaving it together, seeing the interconnectedness of the struggles, but also of the oppressions. It's something that I find gets more and more lost in this present times. There's more fragmentation.
I wanted to add two things to this. So the weaving moment, the necessity of like the weaving moment, but also learning more about like the use of those colonial pots in a way. So from my family history, which is connected also with a self-managed Yugoslav factory, Leda from Knjaževac, that produced female fashion shoes. Delegation had a possibility in the 1980 to travel to Kenya. First of all, they needed British visa, and second, they were flying from Vienna. So the ticket that I have is a ticket from Vienna by an Austrian company. All of the presentation of trip and possibilities of a safari, this or that, presentation of a country is in German. Very interesting. So when you keep repeating about like the necessity to work on the local histories that in the global context also are part of this legacy in a way. This thing of kind of intersecting, as people would say, or interwoven anti-colonial approaches, I think that I really tend to see them in an economic sense or from the economic perspective today, because I somehow feel that the split is too huge to separate into this or that identity struggle. And the way that I always try to frame my interest and work and like approach would be always from the economic topic, the topic that comes with like this moment of we are all serving the global capital, you know, no matter our background. And this is where I see that this potential lies. I don't think that this in any sense undermines any other struggle. I just think that like we really need to talk about redistribution outside of states.
That's true. And at the same time, I also think it's important to have a critical analysis of racialized capitalism at the same time. And this is a critical analysis that has very much left out the majority of the left here. And I remember from struggles, it was most of the time it was either or. It was either race or racialization or class. And the weaving together and gender and this whatever, but the weaving together of all of that and how that finds expression in also, you know, in local realities. I find more practice even in Germany than in Austria. And I also find, even if we look at racialization, we need to also complexify it to the Austrian or to the conditions that we find here. So we do need to weave together different dimensions also, like you mentioned, the inner colonization, which very much is built on anti-Slavism. And so we need to weave the isms together and how they're interconnected, basically. Also, even anti-Semitism, and the different ways of how this is expressed in systems of oppression.
So I completely agree with you that we should work with the notion of kind of racialized capital, but I think that the way that people...
But I'm saying also, not only, but also...
Yeah, but the way that economic exploitation of people who have to take up those opportunities because otherwise they will not survive simply. So, and this is not only related to where do you come from, it's deeply embedded in you know how capitalism works.
Dating back to slavery and enslavement and capitalism and its development. So it's a very long-standing history.
Exact conversation about like bridging struggles. I find this necessity of bridging post-socialist perspective with non-alignment, the colonial perspective. Somehow I find this example very interesting. So the indigenous peoples of Europe, the Wallachians, who were working in a mine in Bor in eastern Serbia, which is nowadays eastern Serbia, and their rebellion is the first ecological rebellion against the French owners of the mine. I find this very interesting. It talks about this shared experience. Of course, no one can say that there is a exact parallel or, you know, that someone like equalizes these things. Definitely not. There is a moment where we could maybe try to discuss some things together.
Yeah, I mean, the question of solidarity and what that means in present days is also in projects by SOS Balkanroute as well, in different ways. Of course, Laboratory of Solidarities asks the same question, but I think this is also the power of the project that the same questions are asked through different positions and perspectives. And one, of course, is the migration regime and its violence, but also the resistance and the solidarities that undermine and counter the regime and have been countering the regime in very generative ways.
Yeah, what I find interesting with EU countries funding other EU countries on the periphery or countries that lie at the border after the EU, like Serbia, Bosnia. EU is giving money so that the countries at the border stop people from entering the EU. And then I always thought of these military troops in the Habsburg Empire that were, that it was Yugoslav people who were at these borders, like the border keepers. And I find this historical parallel very interesting because it's just repeating in its different form in a way. We had these border keepers that worked for the monarchy, and we have them still, in different forms.
And also the extractivism bears so many expressions to what imperialism and neocolonialism means in present day. And it's very loud and it's in the center, but it does not inspire a global resistance in that
because
way.
how do you rebel against something which kind of your government or your governments or the union taught you that it's good?
And also something that is then packaged as sustainable energies, as green transition, something that is then named by the indigenous people in Scandinavia as green colonialism. We are living in a time of green colonialism.
Legalized by the European Union, by the EU Critical Raw Materials Act.
And again, glorified. So maybe in that sense, we can come back to Kwame Nkrumah. There is still, again, the neocolonialism that indices its victims with sweet music. And one of the consisting sweet music is the supposing greenness of it, which we can also look at with regards to cars, electric cars, and the cars that don't fit the requirements being dumped to the African continent. But we might have to end at this point.